Charles couldn't remember the last time he had seen a road sign. He knew, though, that he was by somewhere called Calling Panther Lake, 40 miles outside of Jackson, give or take. Walking along the edge of the interstate at night in Mississippi was unsettling enough, let alone to be treading the edge of a Calling Panther Lake. He was terrified of cats. Ever since he encountered a black panther on his grandfather's property years ago, he's been terrified. The way their eyes in the darkness glow, the way they creep, so weightless, so silent upon the ground, the perfect predator. And people called him crazy when he told them he spent what felt like hours up on a tree branch just inches above the beast. He had held his breath and his tears in case the cat might hear him, and it did. It looked at him with those glowing eyes and made the conscious decision to spare his life. At the age of 10, it was a miracle he didn't piss his pants. But then again, it left him scarred for life. People might have called him crazy, but he knew the truth. There are Black Panthers in North America. Which is why he tried to distract himself by changing Garth Brooks' song Calling Baton Rouge into Calling Panther Lake in his head. But the song lacked melody and rhythm and didn't end up making much sense at all. So he wound up just focusing on his feet. 40 miles to Jackson was a long way to walk, and having walked most of the way already, he was beyond exhausted. Not having much luck hitchhiking during the day, he decided it was useless to try to find a ride that late at night. He knew he would have never picked himself up, so he didn't expect anyone else to. Despite his fantasies of a comfortable seat in an air-conditioned minivan, he knew the only thing he could do was to keep walking to the nearest exit or rest stop and find a bench or even a dumpster to use as a makeshift bed. Disgustingly, he prayed for a dumpster. That way he might even find a bite to eat. Now that he was the one walking along the edge of the road with no money and just the clothes on his back, he felt guilty for all the hitchhikers he had once passed, saying to his now ex-girlfriend in the passenger seat, "Is he serious? I mean, look at him. He's probably a serial killer or something. Maybe, if he got a job, he could afford a shack instead of a box, and maybe a bike or a junker car." He would have grimaced and kept driving, and she would have shrugged and have said, "Hey, you never know where life will take you. Sometimes people just end up in unfortunate situations." Unfortunate. Life. He missed her, he realized. And like usual, she was right. Those old men on the sides of the roads were old war vets whose nightmares and memories wouldn't let them go back to whatever normal was. Men who had lost, physically or emotionally, whatever family they had had. Kids whose parents were never home, and as a result, had no home to go to. People whose futures and pasts keep them constantly running to or from something or someone, even themselves. Walking the edge of the interstate in Mississippi at night, with the chance he might get hit by a car or attacked by a giant cat at any given minute, gave Charles D. Garrett too much to think about. That's when he realized the hitchhiker is a lonely and desperate soul who is probably more afraid of you than you are of him. Charles was young. His Texas driver's license said he was only 22 years of age. Before he had had his dream, though, he had always viewed himself as being older and more mature than most of his peers. So really, he had no idea how old he was anymore. Walking north up Interstate 55, aimlessly trying to make his way to Tell City, he felt that he was older when he was younger. Since the night of his dream, he had become more immature and more impulsive than he ever had any right to be. A new light painted the Mississippi night, as an old truck came over the hill Charles had just climbed. The truck swerved abruptly into the left lane at the bottom of the hill and came back to the right lane. Charles sighed. Another person passing him on their journey would take some 5 minutes in an air-conditioned automobile will take him hours on foot. At this point, he had passed being bitter and moved on to just being wistful. The truck's brake lights lit up the South Dakota license plate, and the gravel popped beneath its wheels as it pulled off to the side of the road. Charles tilted his head, hesitant to believe yet another one of his dreams would be entering into reality. A woman jumped out of the pickup. Her long black hair bounced as she slammed the door and began to march up the hill. Charles slowed his pace. In his hysteria, he saw her as an angel sent from hell. The red taillights from the truck framed her silhouette, which was drastically curved. Her skin was dark from the sun. Her cheekbones were high and defined. She was a younger, thicker version of Cher in worn leather boots, cut-off jeans, and a vintage Kansas t-shirt. He continued to watch the glow of the taillights on her ebony hair and the tangles of smoke that wafted from her cigarette pinched between her fingers. She only stopped moving in slow motion when she began to scream at him. "Are you damned near crazy?" Charles painfully ran to reality as she stopped abruptly in front of him. What? Her eyes were wide. She popped out her left hip and rested her hand holding the cigarette upon it. Do you see how dark it is? And do you know how hard it is to see you in this darkness? Do you? She pointed the tip of the lit cigarette in his face. I almost hit you. I can guarantee every asshole driving down this road is either drunk, stoned, or sleep deprived. And you're just strolling along. Are you stupid or something? You're gonna get hit by a car, like you almost just did. She paused to take a drag from her cigarette. She inhaled and forced all the smoke out of her lungs so she could continue. Did you see your light flash before your eyes? Charles stared at her blankly and said nothing. Did you? No, he cleared his throat. No, ma'am. Well, you should have. She took another drag from her cigarette and scrutinized him in the dead red light. What the hell are you doing out here anyway? Charles straightened his back and shoved his hands into his pockets. I'm going to Tell City. Tell City. She tossed down her cigarette and crushed it with the toe of her boot. Where the hell is that? Charles looked up where Interstate 55 disappeared into the shadows of trees. He sighed and replied, Indiana. And you're just gonna walk the whole damn way? No. Yes. If I have to. Both of them looked up the hill with squinted eyes as another car came speeding past. Like she had done, the car quickly swerved into the left lane until safely up the road a ways. Well, how about this? She looked back over at him, her thumbs in her belt loops. You tell me my name, and I'll take you as far as I can. Charles's eyes narrowed. You want me to tell you your name? Yep. They stared at each other for a moment, waiting for the other to make a move. A heavy drop of sweat ran down the corner of his eye, and he blinked furiously to unblur his vision. The red taillights expanded into luminous rays. My grandfather always says if you meet a meaningful stranger, you probably knew him before in a past life. And since I'm not going to drive 500 miles with a complete stranger, you better prove you know me from before. He watched her as she lit up a cigarette from a pack she pulled from her back pocket. Charles was confused. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I can't tell you who I am right now, he said. So I can't tell you who you are. He put his glasses back on, believing he might be crazy, but there were still people in this world possibly crazier than him. So I'm not going to get into the car with a complete stranger either. Until you prove that you knew me from this past life, I'm just going to keep walking. Resuming walking again hurt more than he thought it would. His muscles had quite enjoyed standing still for a moment. Holy shit, you're Charles Garrett, aren't you? He stopped. Or at least you used to be. Charles remained frozen as she continued. She looked up at the trees in the sky. God damn it, Grandpa! How do you know who I am? She looked back down at him, her dark hair shadowing her face. I don't know who you are. I know who you used to be, and, she paused, who you're going to be. You might as well get in, she said. Besides, there are panthers in these here parts. I bet you being mauled to death wouldn't be too much fun. He looked at her blankly. You too, huh? She smiled for the first time, a smile that was crooked and sharp. Yep. He began walking to the passenger side of her truck. The pain in his muscles was eased, knowing that in a few short steps he'd be sitting. By the way, the young woman said, my name is on my license plate. She laughed a laugh that sounded like an animal's cry and jumped into her truck. Wile-E. Her custom South Dakota license plate said, Wile-E. Charles climbed into the pickup, which in the darkness appeared black, but now close up he could see it was a dark blue. The door creaked and clanked as he slammed it shut. The rough metallic sounds made him feel as if he were closing the hatch on an old World War I tank. Wile-E? He asked. She put the truck into drive and peeled off the gravel median onto the road. It's my nickname. She took the last inhale from her cigarette and tossed the butt out the window. I hate it, but everyone else seems to think it fits, so, well, what's your real name? She looked at him out of the corner of her eye. Her sharp smile gleamed in the dashboard lights. Names aren't important. His brows furrowed. Why don't you get some shut-eye and you can tell me all about this Tell City when you come to, okay? Charles was trying to decide whether or not Wile-E was holding him prisoner by mandate of God as he sat in her truck outside roadside motel in Missouri. The sun was beginning to rise, and Wile-E decided it was time to rest. She stepped out of the motel lobby and walked back to the truck. She put the truck in drive and began the search around the parking lot for their room number. Were you thinking about Tell City? Yeah. Okay, what about it? She pushed on the brakes, having passed the room. She backed up and pulled into a parking space. I don't know, really. He unbuckled his seatbelt. I just know I have to go there. The city has something to tell me. It sounds crazy. Yes, it does. Wiley got out of the truck and leaned her seat forward. She grabbed a worn leather backpack from behind the seat. Charles got out of the truck and closed the rusted door. But I know what you mean. Wiley pulled her hair out of her face as she walked up to the room. He handed her the key card and she opened the door. Neither of them turned on the light. The darkness was too comforting after driving in it all night. Prophetic dreams happen all the time, she continued. It's just that sane people choose to ignore them. That is, until after it comes true. She threw her bag on the first of the two beds. Then everyone wants credit for being the first to know. And then she plopped down on the mattress. Well, my dream wasn't the foreseeing of an event. Charles sat down in a chair by the front window. He pulled off his boots. Still counts. She looked up at the ceiling. It was the foreseeing of your destiny. Like it was destiny that I just had to run into you. She playfully scoffed. I don't believe in destiny. Wiley looked over at him, puzzled. So, you abandoned everything for what, then, if not for your destiny? Charles leaned back into the chair. I don't know. No, she said and looked back at the ceiling. You know. It's destiny. Charles D. Garrett might not have believed in destiny, but you, whoever you are now, you wouldn't have done this if you didn't. If you say so, you obviously know me better than I do. As a matter of fact, I do. She smirked and closed her eyes. Charles thought about that for a moment and realized she was quite possibly right. Every action he had taken since his prophetic dream was entirely out of character. He thought he would marry Jenna after college, get a job in Houston, Texas skyscraper, and then live out the rest of his days in a clean-cut 2, maybe 3-story house. Never did the thought cross his mind that he would be a wandering vagrant sleeping in a ghetto hotel room with a random woman who was obviously insane, after she had picked him up off the side of the road in the middle of the night. If anyone understood his newly found madness, it was this woman who believed her grandfather to be God. Charles sighed because whoever he was now didn't seem to care about his current circumstance. He was just grateful that someone did save him off the side of the road, and that she did understand, because Jenna didn't, his parents didn't, and part of him, whoever he used to be, he sure as hell wouldn't understand. Charles finally bent over to take off his new white socks that they had just picked up at a truck stop earlier that morning. Walking over to the other side of the room, he realized just how sore his muscles were. Every bone in his body cracked as he collapsed onto the second bed. He never thought a motel room bed could be so comfortable. Before he could fall asleep, he looked over to Weil E. Why are you going to Harrisburg? She yawned. All my brothers are there. Your brothers? Most of the good ones, anyway. Bugs will be there, and Smokey, Tiny, Buzzy, Jack. Jack? Charles laughed. Is he the only one with a normal name? Wiley smiled. I guess you could say that. Charles then noticed her smile reminded him of the Joker from Batman, the Jack Nicholson version. How many brothers do you have? A lot, she said flatly. Now, I don't know about you, but I have nocturnal tendencies. We'll shoot the breeze later. Go float or swim or sing or whatever you do when you're asleep. Just close your lids already. Charles laughed and put his glasses on the nightstand next to him. He closed his eyes. Though he did not float or swim or sing, he walked. He walked into the sunset past Santa's workshop and up and down hills with farm and trees on both sides. Roadside signs told him that Tell City was one sacrifice away. He ate. He ate an apple on the same tree as the apple eaten by Snow White. True Love's arrows would not save him, though. They could, however, destroy him. He was taken to a castle where fear was king, but where it also cannot dwell, for if it does, the kingdom will fall. It was the most revered of all castles, and the keeper of its gate was blind. He touched his reflection in a well, and all was lost. It wasn't long after he started walking that clouds began to roll in and consume the few hours of daylight that were left. He supposed the looming rain was likely to be more bearable than the heat and humidity he was walking in just a day before when Wiley had picked him up. Or had it been longer than that? He couldn't remember. Charles began to wonder if Jenna had changed at all, if anyone was looking for him, if he could even get in and out of Tell City, before he found his picture tacked up on a Walmart entrance sign, or he had a full 5-minute segment on national news where Barbara Walters interviewed his parents and classmates about his disappearance. He thought he should be more disturbed by these thoughts of his loved ones searching for him, missing him. But truly he was more afraid that he might get caught or stopped before he even reached Tell City. He feared they'd catch him and drag him around in chains and a straitjacket, and they'd force him to explain his prophetic dream in front of cameramen and news crews. Religious extremists would call him a prophet, and psychologists would diagnose him with having some sort of German-sounding mental problem. Charles was clearly lost and terribly afraid of being found. It would ruin everything. Robert Wood had a dream about his hometown that morning. Even as he climbed into his patrol car, the damn thought scratched around in his skull, like a maggot gnawing in an apple. He never liked to bring home to work or work home, and he sure as hell never wanted to think about his old home at all. As far as he was concerned, the best memory he had of that place was the day he left it. It was typical, being the only colored family in a small town. Bad things happened. He was a kid, after all, and it was the 70s. But it wasn't even that. It was all the holier-than-thou self-righteousness of everyone in town, thinking that they knew something, that they were better because of it. He couldn't deal. It was right before he snapped that his miracle came. By late afternoon, Robert had circumnavigated the whole town without so much as a call for domestic violence at the trailer park or for Mrs. Kraft's supposedly stolen lawn gnomes again. His thoughts were itching at him. His coffee was cold. Dark clouds were rolling in, turning the world into a gray canvas for his memories to play on over and over again. He had to get his mind on something else. The state roads outside of town were his last resort. There was always someone speeding or driving around with a tail light out. It would get his mind back on track, help him to forget. When he left the place, it took him years to forget it all. All the miracles, all the bullshit. It took him a while to understand how the real world functioned. The real world doesn't tell you everything you want to know. You can't sit helplessly by, letting the walls of your life crumble at your feet as you wait for some damn miracle to save you. You have to find it in yourself. Find it yourself. It's better that way. Living, experiencing. The only good Tell City ever did him was it told him how to get out. That was his miracle. A cool drink of water. A sign on a gas station window right next to an Uncle Sam poster. He joined the Navy when he turned 18, never to return. He rounded a turn on the winding country road. Gray trees guarded him on both sides. Ahead in the gloom, Robert saw a young man walking close to the trees with a backpack on his shoulder. The kid must have seen the headlights, for he turned to look back, but he must not have seen the light bar on the top, for he stuck out his thumb to grab a ride. Robert flipped on his lights. Hitchhiker on the outskirts of town. The perfect solution to get his mind off things. That was a miracle. He pulled up just behind the kid, which to his surprise did not run off into the woods. He just squinted into the flashing lights like he was looking off into the sun. Robert stepped out of his patrol car, slamming the door, to draw clear attention to the word sheriff, painted boldly in brown and tan letters across the car. One hand rested on his gun, the other grabbed his flashlight and shined it at the young man. "What are you doing, kid?" Robert walked up to him, shoulders back. The red and blue lights danced around through the trees. He smiled, awkwardly. Just walking." "Just walking, huh? Hitchhiking? Trying to catch a ride?" The young man looked down, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. "Listen, I don't want any trouble." "Oh, I'm sure you don't. I just need to see your ID. Do a check on you real quick. You got your ID on you, don't you?" The hitchhiker pressed his lips together, looking back down at the ground. "No." "No," Robert echoed. He twitched his index finger on his gun. The kid's eyes darted to the pistol. It worked every time. And it's when it didn't work that Robert knew he had a long night of paperwork ahead of him. "Please step up to the car." "So, let's get to know each other then, all right?" The kid didn't respond as he sat handcuffed in the back of the car. "Where are you traveling from, Garrett?" Robert met Charles's fearful gaze in the mirror once again. "Houston," he said flatly. "Texas, huh?" Robert picked up his coffee he had bought on his break a few hours ago. The red to-go cup felt like ice to the touch, but he took a sip anyway. He regretted it immediately. Charles's eyes followed the cup as he set it back down in the holder. "So, kid," Robert glanced at him, "where you hitching to? Some concert or something?" Charles raised an eyebrow, still gazing at the coffee cup sitting in front of him. Robert looked back at the cup. It was just a red paper cup with the Folgers logo of the rising sun over the mountainscape. "Look," Robert focused on the road as he made a turn out of the country back towards town. If you work with me, I'll get you a cup of joy at the station. Hell, I'll get you a sandwich, too. So, tell me where you are heading. Charles looked back at the sheriff and said, Tell City. The patrol car came to a screeching halt. The ride had been silent until they reached the rest stop off the interstate. Robert could not think clearly. Numbness took over, and there was no escape. Not even the humming of the road or the patter of the rain could bring him back. He had witnessed too many evils in Tell City, and he had done so well in forgetting them all. And all it took was one damn dream to make it all rush back. The dream, the hitchhiker. This was the work of Tell City, he thought. It was trying to tell him something. The kid cleared his throat. So, he began, what is Tell City? Why is it so... He made a mess of hand gestures trying to explain what he was thinking. Listen, kid. Tell City is a place of miracles. Messages from God. His words were heavy with disdain. It's a place that tells you what you need. It gives you answers, kid, but it's not right. It's not natural. The things it tells people, the things it hides, it can kill a person more often than it can save them. You're better off hitchhiking back to wherever you came from. Miracles and answers from God, Charles said, don't really sound like a bad thing. Some things are better off people not knowing. The car was quiet. Rain echoed off the roof, only emphasizing the silence. What happened to you there? Robert's eyes rimmed with tears. The last time he cried was in 1987 on a burning ship in the Persian Gulf. He tried to force the tears back down his throat. My mama, at a real young age, just wanted to know the Lord was watching her. She wasted her whole life, every single hour of it, watching for a sign. She died waiting for that sign. When I saw it plain as day. She never got a sign that he was watching because that was her sign that he wasn't. He wasn't watching her. He doesn't watch any of us. He fought back the tears. My baby cousin wanted to know her future, wanted to know who she'd grow up to be. Apparently, Tell City told her. She killed herself the very next day. This one man I knew, his miracle took away his sight. He went blind. The kid looked at him. He had something in his eyes, sympathy, maybe pity. What about you? I was one of the lucky ones, Robert said. Look, if miracles exist, if God exists, it's not supposed to be like this, kid. So go home. It's not supposed to be like the way it is in Tell City. He saw a look on the young man's face, fear and confusion. He shouldn't have said anything. He should have known this would be too much. Something like this was always too much for anyone. Sheriff, Robert said quietly. Charles said quietly. I appreciate it. Your advice, giving me a ride in this weather, he laughed. But I've got to know what all this shit means. Charles looked off into the rain. I am so terrified of all of this, of everything that has happened to me in just this month, let alone what's going to happen to me as soon as I get to Tell City. But he took a breath. If I let it all in, I'll call up my mommy and daddy, they'll fly me back to Texas, and then this was all for nothing. So, thanks, but I've got to go. Charles opened up the door and stepped out into the pouring rain. The next morning was a clear and sunny day. The rays of the sun evaporated whatever puddles were left from the rain the night before. Robert sat down at his desk with a warm cup of coffee, and he thought about Tell City. This time he allowed the memories passage into his consciousness. He did not fear them. There was little paperwork to be done, only a few letters to read, and envelopes to be addressed. So after that morning routine, he typed the name Charles Garrett into his police software. After glancing through about 100 males in Texas by the name of Charles Garrett with one T and Charles Garrett with two T's, he found the right kid from Houston. He was 22, brown hair, brown eyes, 5'11", about 145 pounds. He was missing, and the entire state of Texas was looking for him. Charles had a nightmare that night. It shouldn't have been a nightmare, but it was. The king was approaching. The king was nearing. Between himself and the well was the Black Panther. It just sat there, staring at him with golden eyes. It moved its tail back and forth, ticking. He stared into the cat's eyes. Hyperventilation. He was sinking. He was choking, but he couldn't move. The king was nearing. The well was so close, but still, unobtainable. Ticking of the clock, the panther just watched, its massive form motionless, in front of the well. The tail ticked, the king had to be defeated, the apple eaten, the toll paid, the sacrifice made. It said welcome to Tell City. It shouldn't have been a nightmare, but it was, probably because of the panther. It all seemed too familiar, like deja vu. Road signs told him Tell City, 9 miles. Charles had seen that road sign before. He had seen the road before. It must have been from one of his dreams. The Indiana summer sun beat down on the countryside. Bugs chirped from the farm and the trees surrounding him. It was a loud, dry, surreal hum that electrified the air. The buzz crept along the surface of Charles's skin. It was the mock applause and cruel laughter of the earth as it waited for him to cross the threshold. There was no turning back, even if he wanted to. There was only going forward into the unknown dangers. The bugs knew this as they watched and chattered and placed bets on his life. Charles ate the last of his nutrition bars already, and his stomach was beginning to growl. Charles looked up from his feet and saw an old white pickup with a Born to Kill bumper sticker parked alongside the road. He slowed his pace, and he came closer to it. The truck was empty aside from crushed Coca-Cola and Monster cans and a camouflaged ball cap sitting on the dash. He turned to continue walking, but froze to the sound of tramping feet and breaking twigs on the other side of the road. 2 young men, about the same age as Charles, emerged from the woods, carrying fishing poles, tackle boxes, and a cooler. The 2 men saw him standing by the truck, and they stopped. A moment went by without a sound. Finally, the big man with the beard nodded. "Sup, son?" Charles nodded. "Not a lot." The 2 boys walked across the road to their truck. "Sorry," Charles continued. "I was just walking, and I saw the truck. I was just making sure everything was okay." "It's cool. We was just down by the river, throwing our rods," the bearded man said, and started to dance out the motions of throwing out a fishing line and reeling it back in. Charles raised an eyebrow as he watched. "Right." Behind him, the other man, who was much thinner and taller than Charles, laughed as he lowered the tailgate to put the fishing pole and the cooler in the bed. Charles felt awkward. Both of the men had their eyes on him, sizing him up, for a reason he couldn't understand. He just knew every word he said was a crucial decision point in their judging. Did you catch anything?" "Yeah," the bearded man answered. He licked his lower lip. He looked at his companion by the tailgate. "Go ahead, Steve. Show him the loot." The skinnier man grinned and dragged the cooler with his bony hands across the bed close to his chest. He looked at Charles and winked before he ripped open the lid to the cooler. Charles half expected to see organs and blood from a sacrificial deer, but instead saw ice, beer, and fish. There were several bluegill and bass, all gasping through their gills and begging him with their glassy eyes to be put back in their aquatic home. Charles laughed. "Looks like you all had a good morning," he added. "You had me going for a second there." Steve closed the tailgate as his bearded friend snickered and put his fishing gear in the bed as well. "Yeah, well, we've had a lot of creeper visitors around here recently, and with you creeping around my truck, I didn't mean to creep. He paused. "I've been walking for a while, and I thought that there might be someone who could give me a ride." "Well, where are you going?" Steve asked, closing the cooler. "Tell City." "I don't know, Brandon." Steve looked at Charles up and down. "Do you think he passed the EIT test?" Brandon nodded. "Yeah, he's EIT." He looked at Charles. "Hop in the bed, Jack." Charles took his backpack off his shoulder. Though it wasn't heavy, it was a relief to free his shoulder from the burden. "I do really appreciate this." "That's how we do." Brandon opened the passenger side door and slid into the truck. The truck roared to life and peeled off the gravel shoulder. Later that night, Steve and Brandon had the truck backed up to the bank of Windy Creek after nightfall. They sat on the tailgate with one hand lightly holding a fishing pole, the other gripping onto a beer bottle. Between the 2 of them, the case of beer was nearly gone. Country music played from a smartphone sitting on top of the blue cooler. "Here's what I'm thinking," Brandon said. Steve looked over at him while finishing off his beer. "If this magic can make Desiree psychic and her old man a priest, why can't it share the love, huh?" Steve chuckled in response and tossed the bottle and tossed the empty bottle off into the rocks. When I go, I'm asking for money. Yeah. I could get myself a new truck and a hunting lodge up near Bloomington or something. I'd get out of this podunk town. Living the good life. Hell, Steve opened up the lid to the cooler and said as a side note, change that country music, dude. I'm tired of listening to that whiny-ass shit. He handed Brandon the phone and pulled out 2 beers, setting one on the tailgate for Brandon. If that were possible, if magic could work like that, I wouldn't just ask for money. I'd paint myself black and go be a rapper. They make bank. Brandon scrolled through the phone to find a song. A steady beat began to play. Steve opened his beer. Women and good all the time, round the clock 24/7. Brandon smiled and licked his lower lip. You got a problem with that, son. You see, you can't rap. Where'd it go? There it is. Yeah, well, that's what the oracle is for, right? If it could. But it can't. Brandon set his beer down on the tailgate. Well, what the hell is magic good for if it can't do anything? Now, boys, a deep southern voice said from behind them. Steve and Brandon slowly turned around. Behind them stood a man with dark blonde hair, and his eyes were dark and muddy. What if? He hopped onto the tailgate in the narrow space between Brandon and Steve. He took over the ownership of Brandon's beer and drank. What if magic could do something? Something like what you was just talking about. Actually, he paused, it can do all of that and more. He drank. Either of you interested? There are some things people are better off not knowing. And Desiree Hart wished she never knew what happened to her father that night he became priest to the oracle. It was dark and cold when John Hart found the shack in the woods. He had been the first and only person to find the shack alone. The tradition was, and still is to this day, that only a person who has gone before can show you where it is. Others have tried and have failed. He found it, though, on that chill November night. But later in his life, he and others close to him would wonder if he really had been truly alone. He had been drinking at McGrath's pub that night, trying to swallow with more than just the whiskey. But it was hard to drown the memories when everyone he talked to felt the sympathetic urge to mention her name, Marie. She had given him the world, and then she was gone, and he was alone. A black hole had begun to grow in his chest. Every part of him was slipping away. He knew that soon there would be nothing left of him. John kept waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares, and he would roll over to hold her, to feel her warmth against his flesh, but she wouldn't be there. He felt the urge to run to her for comfort, but there was no one to run to. Without her, his soul and his entire being were lost. John was barely holding on, and without her, all he wanted to do was to let go. The young man had to see her again, his wife, Marie. If he could see her again, she could save him. She always did. He stumbled from the bar and ran to the woods. His cries echoed through the night as he stumbled drunkenly through the trees. The whole forest bowed to the sound, for it was the sound of a dark and tragic death. A heavy frost covered the trees and the ground. The world was fragile and still. John rested for a moment against the rough bark of an oak to wipe away the icy tears from his face. His vision was blurred with both the tears and the liquor, so when he walked out into the barren meadow, he almost didn't see that tiny crooked shack. The shack was decrepit and leaning. The meadow grass drooped with the weight of the frost and the ice. Vines crept up along the wooden panels. They were thick with thorns, and they guarded the shack and all its magic. As John opened the door, the bones of the structure moaned. The hinges creaked. Candles lit up the walls, and the dripping wax from the candles had hardened in puddles on the floor. John stepped across the threshold carefully. "Hello?" "Greetings," said an old man's voice. In what a second ago had been an empty corner, a man now stood. The man with the white beard was pale and dressed in black. My name is John Hart. He walked in further. The old man nodded. I know who you are. The oracle foretold your arrival. His voice was as deep as the night sky, and he spoke with an authority as wise as the stars. John looked off into the flickering light of the candles. I lost my wife. She died. This I also know. The oracle has told me so. John looked back up into the old man's shadowed face. I have to see her again. I have to see her. I need her. The oracle cannot undo what has been done. It cannot bring her back. That's not... John's breathing was ragged, and his voice was wavering. That's not what I mean. I need to see her, hear her voice just one more time. I need that. The man walked carefully up to John. His feet were bare, and each step he took had a timeless grace and a ritual purpose. He moved as if he were walking across water, or walking in a dream. There is one way the oracle told me of, many eons ago, said the oracle's priest, but it requires a great sacrifice. John gazed into the priest's eyes. They were white. He was blind. The old priest's bones creaked as he raised his wrinkled hand. He was older than the shack itself. Our secrets are buried in our hearts. He touched his hand to John's chest. Revealing them is nothing less than the sacrifice of human art. Name it, John pleaded. I'll do anything. He took in and released a deep breath. You are ready, my son, he said. He glided his fingertips up to John's neck and face until they rested on his brow. The palm of the priest's hands covered John's eyes, and all went white. Robert and Daniel Wood were young men at the time. They had found John kneeling by the side of the road that night. He was drunk, and blood dripped from his eyes. They offered to take him to the nearest hospital, but he demanded that they just bring him home. They dropped him off at his mother's house, which was where he had been staying, so that she could take care of him and his 3-month-old baby girl. With blood still dripping from his eyes, he stumbled through the front door. He could hear the late-night rerun of Bewitched playing on the television, but all he saw was static. Though he could not see her, his mother was asleep on the couch. John searched with his hands until he found the stair rail. He climbed the stairs and felt his way down the hall to his baby's nursery. She was asleep in the crib. He searched around through the blankets until he found her tiny body. Gently and carefully, he picked her up out of the crib and into his arms. Her sleep being disturbed, she began to whine. I'm sorry, Desiree. John began to cry. The salt stung his eyes. I am so sorry, my little girl. He fell down to the floor, and holding her tight in his arms, he rocked her back and forth. His body shook with violent tears. I am so sorry. The baby girl began to wail. The night her father became priest of the oracle was forever burned in her mind. It was the first thing she saw when she was given her mother's gifts. Desiree pulled her eyes away from the crystal ball in the center of the table. It was actually glass, not crystal, but her clients didn't need to know. She glanced over to the spirit altar on her right. The wax from the lit candles had begun to puddle on the table and drip off onto the floor. Shit! Desiree flew from her seat and blew out the candles. The wax had already done its damage to the carpet, and she would have to try to clean it later once it dries. But it wouldn't be the first time, or the last time. The damage deposit on the building wasn't too outrageous, but Mr. Spencer, the landlord, was exceedingly nitpicky and fussy with her because of her line of work. Being the town psychic, her reputation preceded her. Desiree looked down at the offering she had left to honor the dead. There were clip-outs from the obituaries, candies, pennies, and shells. She picked up the picture of her mother. It was a photo of her at McGrath's. Desiree never thought she looked like her. Straight black hair, smooth tanned skin, a lean feline face. Desiree looked more like her father. Curly brown hair, pale skin, and a square jaw. But as she grew older, she began to see a resemblance. It was in the eyes. The box of black hair dye she used every few months helped a little, too. Desiree was 16 when she went to the oracle. She just wanted to know what her mother was like, and as its priest, her father could not refuse the request. John Hart never spoke about his wife after the night he had become priest, and because of his silence, Desiree never knew who her mother was. She never knew how powerful she was, until the oracle showed her. It gave her her mother's powers. Desiree touched her lips to the picture of her mother and set it in its place on the altar. The bells on the front door jingled. The psychic was well into her 30s, but she still had the body to make any woman jealous, slender, fit, and perky. She wore tight-fitted jeans, a black studded belt, and a Harley-Davidson tank that hugged every curve. Charles never expected to meet a psychic who would look and dress like that. "Come on in." Her voice was deep and smooth, and Charles had trouble ignoring all the things his old self was saying as he watched her tramp stamps swaying back and forth on her hips while he followed her into the back room. The back room was much like the front, only darker. There were no windows. The room was lit only by the flickering flames of black candles. There was a table in the center, and it was draped with a long burgundy cloth. Charms and symbols decorated the walls. There were altar tables covered with candles and trinkets and wax. Along the walls were shelves that were cluttered with jars filled with herbs and colored oils. A tingle went up Charles's spine as he decided that behind the decorations of her psychic stage, she was no whack-job scamming psychic. There was something behind the decorations he couldn't see, but he could feel. "Have a seat," she purred, and she sat down in her chair on her side of the table. Charles pulled out the Victorian chair on the other side and sat. "Why have you come to me?" she asked in a voice that was flirtatious, rehearsed, and used on all new clients. Charles held in his laughter, knowing some things have to be done to fulfill clients' fantasies and stereotypes. He cleared his head and tried to remember why he had came. "Do you do dream interpretations?" "I do," she smirked with a glint in her eye. "Great." Charles ripped into his backpack and pulled out a spiral ring journal, "because I have a few of them." The look on her face changed instantly from her facade into something much more real. "You have these dreams often?" Her ring-covered hand reached out over the crystal ball in the center of the table and took the journal. "It was a dream that brought me here. I lived in Houston. I had a dream about this place," Charles said. Desiree began thumbing through the dreams he had had over the last few nights. "And that's when it started. And that's why I came," Charles explained. Desiree chuckled. "You had a dream about this shithole?" Charles's brow narrowed. "I know the town's secret," he said in a hushed tone. "Oh, yeah?" She leaned back in her chair, still skimming through the journal. "And what secret is that?" Charles leaned back as well. "I don't know, really. I just know that the town, it tells you things. Like an oracle, I guess." Desiree slowly looked up. Their eyes met. She dove into his aura. It was humming. It was electric. It felt like a storm. She closed the journal and set it on the table. "Yeah? Well?" She laced her fingers and set her elbows on the arms of the chair. "It's still a shithole." Charles cracked a smile, and she continued. "Tell me about your dream, then. The first one." Charles's eyes drifted off as he remembered. "There was a flood. People were screaming. There was war going on. There was magic. Not like Houdini magic, but something subtler. I didn't see it, but I knew it was there. And there was this castle that everyone was running to. And there was this flood, and it was alive, and it was trying to get there too. But when I was running, I found this apple, and it was the castle. I tried to tell the other people, but they wouldn't listen. Then I was sitting on this stone well in a castle, but it wasn't in a castle, it was outside. And I had that apple in my hand." He looked up at Desiree. "There was a road sign in front of me that said Tell City. I remember looking at it and knowing I had to go there. But this king," Charles laughed, "was coming. And there was this panther, and I hate cats. I mean, I am terrified of cats because of the black panther I saw as a child. And I had to eat the apple, but he found his eyes had wandered off again, and he looked back up at Desiree. I woke up.